Let's go to this conversation now. Court interpreters are critical when it comes to access to justice. As South Africa navigates multilingualism, there have been concerns raised about the accuracy of interpretation in some of these cases. And what are some of the implications then of this? We're joined by Julius Dantile, who is the executive head of languages at the Pan South African Language Board. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. Let's start by looking at the importance of accurate interpretation, especially in proceedings where defendants don't understand English.
Good evening to viewers. And the situation is that in South Africa, we have a guarantee in terms of Section 39 of the Constitution that people must have a fair trial. And one of the requirements for that particular fair trial is an issue of language. What then the Constitution prescribes is that there should be, the proceeding must be understood, especially by the accused. Which then it says that the language that must be used in a court proceeding must be the language that is understood by all the participants in the court process. But where we start in South Africa, we start by saying that who's not understanding the language, and then we run into interpreting. But the first level in the Constitution is that the language that is spoken in a court should be tested whether everyone is understanding that particular language. Now, we see these ones in a higher court. I want us to take this particular scenario into a court that is in the small rural town, where everyone in that town speaks one language, mainly. And what then you see happening is that what we go to is the second level of a situation whereby we start by saying, let's provide interpreting first. Then this creates an environment whereby, which allows one language to be dominant, which is English, as declared by, decreed by the Chief Justice in 2017, that English is the language of record in the courts. And that creates an environment then whereby we are forced to use English and interpreting, which makes other languages not to enjoy parity of esteem as guaranteed by the Constitution. And that is the problem. Now, I was just putting up a constitutional framework that this is a guaranteed framework within the Constitution that people must get a fair trial through their own languages.
And how much of a challenge is it then, especially when you look at the issue of, what you've just mentioned, where in some cases presiding officers are in some of these remote areas or in some of these courtrooms, they do not understand the language that is spoken there, as you say, the dominant language. How much of that also poses a challenge if, for example, an interpreter is not up to scratch when it comes to the interpretation?
There is a Latin phrase that says traditore, traditore. In English means a translator is traitor, which then goes into an element of saying it is impossible to have 100% accuracy, especially in the context of translation and interpreting, because you are running two processes at the same time, one from one culture and language, and you are transmitting that and imparting that message to another culture that has got its own permutation and its own ways of expression, tonations, and other cultural aspects, semantic aspects, let alone even the writing systems in other contexts. Now, you can't be 100% accurate. It is impossible. But what you are striving for is to ensure that the message that is from the sender to the receiver is transmitted adequately, that the other person who's receiving the message is able to understand that particular message and to understand that message in context. With the interpreters, they're faced with a situation of saying they have to do this within seconds. And it's not a very easy process to do. It needs a lot of training, a lot of techniques, a lot of competency that is involved in terms of someone to be a competent interpreter.
And I suppose it's tricky as well to have to do it in minutes and in seconds, especially when it comes to, you know, in some instances you hear about Zula Stoligo, and
Yes.
there may be no legal term for whatever it is that the defendant may be saying or the sender to the receiver, you know, that particular broken telephone. So without these legal terminologies in some of these indigenous languages, it makes it difficult to interpret on the spot.
Yes, here and there. For instance, today we saw the interpreter in the tribunal could not interpret instantly perjury, and that is the case. And at that particular moment, the interpreter cannot recall what is the meaning or what is the equivalent of that particular term. It doesn't mean that that term doesn't exist, for instance, in this context in isiXhosa. But at that particular moment, the interpreter could not recall what would be that particular concept. Now, this is the tricky part where then it comes into the actual interpretation. It's better for the translator because the translator has got the time. You can go and consult dictionaries and other sources to check what is the meaning of this word. Do we have it in the target language? But for the interpreter doesn't have that luxury. It is there, live in a court process where this transmission is taking place, and he or she has to then make a decision there and there. So you cannot, that's why I'm saying that it will be unfair to really expect 100% accuracy from the interpreting. But what is critical and important is that the message is being transmitted. And in terms of the cases. So when we said that isiXhosa or isiZulu Stoligwa, we meant that these languages have their own permutations. And it should not be, remember those phrases are coming during the struggle period, where certain things that were being said should not be then conveyed to the enemy. So there were phrases and or idioms that comes from a context again. It's not that you cannot interpret or translate this particular language. You can. But because of the context, in that particular context, they will tell you it's because of story. But therefore, what we have said, only those who are meant to receive the message must receive this particular message.
And I tell you what, some people still hold on to that, and they'll always refuse. They'll always refuse that it be translated because they tell you, no, don't go there. But certainly, as you say, it's such an important conversation that I wish we circle back to you and I, because when we look at some of these, you know, court proceedings, it's quite a critical one between, you know, access to justice and how some of these matters then get to be interpreted later, and even circle back to the very courts for appeal. But thank you so much, Julius, for your time. And really, this is just scratching the surface of this conversation. Appreciate it, though. That's Julius Dantile, the executive head of languages at the PEN South African Language Board.